so much for taking out your time on your holidays to come here and from every state and I know this time of the year teachers are going through their lesson prep for the entire curriculum, so we really appreciate it. Okay, so this morning I'm going to be talking about, it actually really segues very well from Natalie's presentation about conflict in the Middle East, in particular the European Union's role in the Arab Spring. Someone mentioned before the ambiguity of responses on what exactly the EU does, and that's the thing that was said yesterday. The EU response to the Arab Spring is also quite ambiguous as well, so enjoy. So this is a lecture outline, so we're just going to talk about quickly a brief timeline of the Arab Spring, the EU's relations with the Middle East in general. So they've got the European Neighbourhood Policy. I'll just touch a little bit, but can't go into depth because of time issues. Also the EU's response to the Arab Spring, so how it was a critical but also divided approach, but also the development projects that have been assessed afterwards, and the conclusion. So what exactly was the EU's role in the Arab Spring? What sort of role did the EU play? Now, I just want to ask, how many teachers here teach SOS or BC and global politics? Okay, so there's a couple of you. How many of you talk about the Arab Spring? And how many of you talk about Europe for the EU? Yeah. I bumped into my old internet global politics teacher about this time last year, and she said, all the kids want to learn about is the Arab Spring. They want to know what's going on, but they want to know about America. So I figure this is a very good opportunity to cover what the EU's done, or what they haven't done. So we'll just go through a brief outline of what's happened so far. So there were underlying economic and social tensions in Middle East and North African states, of course. However, the official sort of timeline begins with Tunisia. So 26-year-old Mohammed Bouazizi was the sole income earner in his extended family of 8. And on the 17th of December 2010, his vegetable cart was confiscated by a policewoman. He went to go pay the equivalent of a $7 fine, and instead he was insulted and slapped in the face and insulted about his dead father. So within an hour of his cart being confiscated, he went to the local municipality officials and burnt himself. He died, I think it was 8 days later, in hospital. So that's the official kicking off point of the Arab Spring, and that was on the 17th of December 2010. And then it ended in Tunisia's revolution ended with the president, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. He says he was tricked into resigning, but he's forced exile into Saudi Arabia on the 14th of January 2011. And then we move on with Egypt. So non-violent protests against grievances such as Mubarak's power, his power inheritance, the emergency laws that have been in effect since 1967, the widespread corruption and censorship and the police brutality and economic inequality were underlying factors to the non-violent protests. So they began in January 25th, 2011. And we all remember watching, say, CNN, Sky News, seeing images of Tahrir Square, just hundreds of thousands of people, and also in Alexandria as well. And it ended with the resignation of Hosni Mubarak, but also kind of like a military coup to an extent on February 11th, 2011. And then we move on to Libya. So clashes with security forces began on the 15th of February with 500 to 600 protesters demonstrating in the front of the Benghazi police headquarters after a prominent human rights lawyer, Fatih Tebboune, was arrested. And then, as we know, it escalated into a bloody Libyan civil war, which I can't get into, I apologise, but I'm guessing there's a few people that know an overview of it. And it basically ended on 23rd of October 2011 with the MTC capturing the major Libyan cities, and Muammar Gaddafi dying on the 20th of October 2011. As we all know, that was well publicised on TV. Yemen. So the protests against government reforms began on January 27, 2011, and this basically led to a chain of events. So the uprising in Sana'a, the assassination attempt on the president, and then he was put in a self-imposed 3-month medical exile in Saudi Arabia for treatment. He came back, protests erupted again, and then it basically ended with the swearing in of Abid Rabah Mansour al-Hadi on February 25th, 2012, after a power handover. And the president is still going through the transition of power handover, but this is considered a little more of a success story in the Arab Spring. And then, I'm sorry, I can't get any nice pictures to show about Syria. They're all distressing and graphic. So Syria protests began on March 15, 2011, with protests demanding the resignation of Bashar al-Assad and his Ba'ath regime. So they're still continuing on today. We don't know when they're going to end, and the UN figures from the 3rd of January say that 60,000 people have died. And the most recent detailed conflict that's emerged through BBC News was the bombing of the University of Aleppo. 80 students died as they were sitting their exams. The government's calling it the terrorists, the acts of state terrorism, and then the opposition are saying it was government missiles. Okay, so we've also had unrest across other Middle Eastern countries as well. So Algeria had their 19-year state of emergency lifted after protests. Bahrain, prisoners were released and economic reforms were passed through. Jordan, the King Abdullah II's dissolved the parliament has called for early elections. Oman, economic concessions have been brought in, powers have been granted to the elected legislature, and so they actually have a legitimate stance now in Oman politics. Iraq, the Prime Minister Maliki is ruled out running for a 3rd term. Kuwait, the resignation of the Prime Minister has occurred and the Parliament's been dissolved. Morocco, there's political concessions being put through by King Mohammed, and there's a referendum on constitutional reforms as well. And in Saudi Arabia, municipal elections are being held and women are being promised the right to vote from 2015 onwards. I just put up a little thing. I think it's quite bizarre because women are still not allowed to drive, still not allowed to mix with non-familiar men, and still have to be accompanied by a male, but they will be able to vote in 2015. So the EU's relationship with the Middle East and North Africa. So the EU, if you're not familiar, the EU has a policy called the European Neighbourhood Policy, which it's basically their foreign policy, explained with the neighbours surrounding them. So you have the Euromed countries, which are down the bottom here. The Euromed countries are Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Libya to an extent. Libya are an observer country. They were suspended for a while. Morocco, Palestine, Syria, and Tunisia. And if you can see with the blue here, you've got Turkey. Turkey's not included because they're considered a candidate country for the EU, but with recent developments, that may change. However, yeah, they're not included in the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership. So the EU's relationship with the Middle East is facilitated by the European External Action Service. So it's the Foreign Ministry and the Diplomatic Corps of the EU. The EU's relations, as we've seen it with the European Neighbourhood Policy. The European Neighbourhood Policy was adopted in 2004 as a solution to the hardline approach that was taken by the US towards the Middle East after the War on Terror. And they wanted to avoid the emergence of new dividing lines between the EU and its neighbours after they had the 2004 enlargement. And they wanted to promote economic prosperity, security and stability. So the European Neighbourhood Policy drew up also individual action plans with each member state and free trade agreements as well. And they tried to take it with there's no one-size-fits-all approach. However, in the end, the European Neighbourhood Policy has been criticised for its failure of promoting democracy and human rights to its Euro-Mediterranean partners. So for a body that's received the Nobel Peace Prize, the European Union, prior to the Arab Spring, has not exactly pushed the promotion of human rights. I actually have just here, I'm sorry if I'm going over time, I actually have here some in the individual action plans for Tunisia prior to the Arab Spring. So the strongest aim that they gave Tunisia for promoting human rights and democracy was to continue the support for political parties as to further strengthen their involvement in the democratic process. Prior to the Arab Spring, it was an autocratic government. So how could they support the democratic process when political parties were being opposed? And Egypt was a very similar option as well. Egypt, the strongest option they gave was promoting the protection of human rights in all its aspects and enhancing the effectiveness of institutions entrusted with strengthening in democracy and the rule of law. Again, autocratic government. There's been a state of emergency since 1967. What are the arguments for why the EU has been, why EU and democracy, like EU and the Neighbourhood Policy has been so lax in promoting democracy? Is that the promotion of democracy and human rights no longer was a priority for the EU, and that there were fears that democratising the Mediterranean regimes far too quickly may have local and regional destabilising effects. Okay, so just High Representative Catherine Ashton, I popped a photo in here. She is meeting King Abdullah II of Jordan, and as Natalie's touched on and will probably be discussed later in the lecture on security, Catherine Ashton is like the spokeswoman of the EU. She's the core diplomat of the EU, and she provides over the Commission, the Council. She's head of the External Action Service, so she's the face of European Union foreign policy. So the EU's response to the Arab Spring. So first it was a heavily criticised response, and I'm going to get into some of the responses of the Arab Spring and who's being critical. So the response of the EU was weak and indecisive. They acted as a bystander, basically. So the events that unfolded in the Middle East and North Africa in the Arab Spring, as we know, were a product of civilian anger and frustration with the autocratic regimes. And the Arab Spring perhaps has introduced some of the strongest shake-ups in Arab politics, especially with the collapses of governments in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, potentially Syria, and also economic reforms in Algeria, Morocco and Jordan. There's an academic called Tobias Schumacher. I can't get his link up for you, I'm very sorry, but he has a very good quote about the response to the Arab Spring. The EU displayed an image of a rather fragmented and heterogeneous spectator. The EU responded with hesitation before it resorted to a rather incoherent mix of activism and pacifism. So, as with the Tunisia reaction, for example, basically the statement that was brought out by Catherine Ashton argued that dialogue is the key in the reaction to Tunisia, and that willingness to find lasting democratic solutions was the agenda. But it falls short of actually calling for strong democratic change and strong change of government. And Egypt, there was a slightly stronger reaction. So Egypt, the reaction was stronger, calling on Egyptian authorities to meet the aspirations of the Egyptian people with political reform, not repression. However, this still fell short of calling for Mubarak's resignation. So again, they acted with caution. Okay, and then the response was also divided. So I can't go into too much detail about NATO and security, so I'm just going to discuss the individual responses by different member states. So the response of member states, as we may have not read, was divided. So instead of acting as a unified body, individual member states in fact pursued their own agendas. So there's been growing expectations, especially from the US, for the EU to become involved in security and combat matters, yet one of the hurdles is the divided response. So France, for example, France offered security support for the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia. He offered to send in security experts when protests and unrest broke out. But then it's strange as well because this was under Sarkozy. Sarkozy occasionally then also called for power change in Libya, but wasn't too strong about it. But then France supported the no-fly zone in Libya. So they had one reaction to Tunisia, one to Egypt, one to Libya. Germany was hesitant to involve itself in the Libyan conflict, and that relates to what Natalie previously spoken about money instead of arms and military. And the foreign minister of Germany actually commented.
Money and arms instead of people.
I'm sorry. And also, Germany's foreign minister actually mentioned that the lack of involvement in Libya itself was a scandalous mistake and that it actually damaged its credibility to the UN and the Middle East. Britain allied with France in support of Libya, in the support of Libyan conflict, but then Italy hesitated, which you may actually touch on later with migration in Europe. And yeah, so even with a common defence and security policy that's in place in the European Union, member states fail to take the necessary steps to intervene in conflict via the EU. Instead, it's just individual approaches. Okay, so this is a quote from Martin Schulz's Socialist Group, from the Socialist Group in the European Parliament. I've provided on some links on the USB the article in which this quote's come from, and it's an interview about his response to the Arab Spring. He said, the European Union isn't the problem, the member states are the problem. They're pursuing interests that are sometimes widely divergent. The EU does what it can, but why exactly are all the foreign ministers travelling to the region and on top of that saying different things? So what sort of actor is the EU then in relation to the Arab Spring? So in the case of the Arab Spring, rather than being a defence actor, the EU is playing more of a development role. So they revised the Neighbourhood Economic Policy. So instead of just loosely calling for democratic reforms and supporting democratic parties, they're now adopting a more for more approach. So the more states implement reforms and the quicker they do so, the more funding they receive from the European Union. The less for less approach has also been adopted as well. So states who fail to engage in any sort of democratic reform, economic reform and development, the less funding they receive from the EU and the more sanctions are enforced against them. And they've seen, the EU in their official policy has targeted money, mobility and markets as an approach to development for countries post-Arab Spring. So the European Investment Bank's also lended money to increase development loans for small business companies as well. They've invested €20 million into small business, and they proceeded with free trade agreements for Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt and Jordan. And 1.2 billion has been added to the already 5.7 billion euro 2011 to 2013 budget for the Euro-Med region. And there's also been individual agreements through finance and dialogue proposals that are coming through as well. And in the case of Tunisia, for example, the EU helped facilitate the first legitimate democratic Tunisian elections in October 2011. And there's the EU-Tunisian Task Force as well, and their aid budget was increased to €400 million from €240 million as well to help facilitate development, democratic reform. In Egypt, a €20 million civil society package was kicked in to assist the democratic process, and that helped to fund the 2012 presidential elections. And Morocco is really seeing the extent of the more for more policy. So in 2011, the King of Morocco created a parliament, and so the EU's aid budget to Morocco was increased by 20%. And there's just a picture here, I wasn't able to talk about it too much. There's the Support for Partnership Reform and Inclusive Growth Program run by the European Union. It's called the SPRING Program, and it assists the most socio-economic disadvantaged members in different states, and it assists with development policy. And this is just a picture of some of the work that they've been doing in Tunisia. Okay, so for my conclusion, what is the role of the EU in the Arab Spring? So the EU and the Arab Spring showed that the EU is not necessarily a defence actor. So initial responses to the Arab Spring were reserved. There was calls for dialogue, but there were no concrete democratic reforms, or no calls for democratic reforms. And EU member states acted in a divided manner, not unified. It was also an assertive action as well, and the EU was unable to act. However, the EU is now an actor that's poised to remain in North Africa and the Middle East for a longer period of time, focusing on development work. So they've adapted partnerships with the Euro-Mediterranean states to basically improve them, so a more for more approach instead of just calling for loose reform. Support for development projects to states has also kicked on. So once states that were run by autocratic regimes, and once the EU so heavily relied upon for stabilising the area, the EU is now going in and doing development work instead. Financial funding, so budgets are being boosted, financial support for businesses, and economic development has kicked in as well. And so I've just got this very good quote from Cecilia Malmström. She's the Commissioner for Home Affairs, and she was very critical of the EU's approach in 2011 in a statement released. She said that the EU had an opportunity to become involved in the Arab Spring and become involved in democratic reform and process, and basically they didn't. And this is the last bit of just like a small excerpt of her statement. So there are many who stand ready to construct a new agenda for Europe, an agenda built on human values, on a constructive and open partnership with our neighbours. And that's the approach that they're taking today.
Questions, comments? Edgar.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was very interesting. Sorry, very interesting. I think you gave a very good example that the expectations to the EU are sky high. Please speak louder. The expectations to the EU are sky high. But yesterday I used the example of the budget, which is federal budget, say, which is 1% compared to 26% in Australia. External action is only to the extent EU action, where member states are ready to give sovereignty to the EU. And this is a very good example. I agree with Schulz, who is, by the way, the President of the European Parliament. Member states have been acting in the external service very much independently. And you gave very good examples how they did it in the Arab Spring. I think all what you said is a very good argument for further integration, for further cooperation. And that is something where exactly in the external action, the Commission, the Union is on the way. So I think we should combine this sort of presentation with a critical remark on the level of expectation one can have to a common action of the EU. That's all.
Thank you. Yes.
I've got a couple of questions. It was a good presentation, thank you. Basically, since the Arab Spring and all the wars and all that kind of stuff, has life really improved for the actual citizens of these countries? With employment, living standards, etc.?
From what I've gathered from Summit, because every individual country has their individual needs, the improvement has been, it takes some time. As we've seen with the case of Egypt, there's still protests going on about constitutional law changes. I mean, Tunisia is not bankrupt, but they have had an incredible drop in wealth. There's actually the BBC had a very good slideshow about auctioning off Ben Ali's old, his sports cars, his wife's shoe collection, their gold collection. They have no money. And, you know, it's still development work in Libya, as we've touched on with Natalie. I mean, we have the ambassador to Benghazi, from the United States, killing Benghazi.
Yeah, but there was a lot more behind that. Than
There's a lot more behind it, of course, but it's all taking time. It's not just a quick process. You can't just throw money at a situation anymore and say, okay, well, it's going to get better. It's still taking time. It's all development.
Okay.
I mean, we look at East Timor. We got involved in the East Timor conflict. East Timor's still one of the poorest nations in the world. Things aren't going to change overnight. And it hasn't improved immediately, but it's getting there.
Okay,
Perhaps come back to you. I'll just keep a few of you. Is that okay?
yeah, okay.
I'm just interested in the statement about the divergent responses of the member countries. Don't you think that's a product of their history in the area? So the French have a very divergent approach given their post-colonial.
I really wanted to talk about the colonial history and also geographic location, except then that would actually get into an hour-long, etc. And I wanted to throw Russia as well, but just not enough.
So how do you think they're going to reconcile that issue?
I'll come back to you. There's a few of you, so I'll just take one at a time at the moment.
I'd actually just add to that, because a comment maybe that do they need to reconcile that issue? So have you had a sense that some of the states are pursuing sort of almost a two-track approach where they let the EU handle the development side of things, and then they do the more defence, as you said, the more defence-related?
Absolutely, we've seen it with evidence. I mean, we've seen it with the French approach to the Arab Spring. We've seen it with, mainly the French approach is what I've seen, very diverse responses. But then, I mean, the EU is known as being a promoter of peace. They're the biggest they're the biggest donor of foreign aid. Out of all governments, they're a body, and they're the biggest donor of foreign aid. They've just received the Nobel Peace Prize for their peace efforts in Europe. The EU is an institution that is about peace and development, so they've been left to what they do best.
And also, they're still learning as well, so it's not like the EU's so well established at this point in time where they can say, you know, exactly what we're doing, you know, exactly where we're going, everything's at a certain point. I think it's the fact that the EU is still learning what they can do, what they should do, when to put hands on, when to take hands off, it is important to know as well, and I think that gets neglected a hell of a lot.
Well, the EU has facilitated peace missions too. They were very important in the peace brokering in Aceh, and there have been peace missions conducted by the EU. However, the Arab Spring was just, I forgot to put in, like, it was some countries had taken it by, like, they've been taken by surprise, basically. And the EU has worked before, and they are becoming involved in Mali, as Natalie spoke about. However, they're still learning. So to get member states together and form a concrete action plan it takes time, like all baby steps.
What's your assessment of the Islamic Brotherhood religion and how it works?
It's a hard situation because the war, as I mentioned, democratic stability, introducing too many democratic reforms was seen as a problem in the European Neighbourhood Policy, saying that countries would become too imbalanced too quickly and it was too much. I mean, it's difficult because they were suppressed for years, but now there's the fear from Coptic Christians that they'll be oppressed, there's fear from the secularist movement that was so involved in the uprising in Egypt that they will be oppressed as well. I mean, I don't know too much about what's going with the Islamic Brotherhood, however, I think that they will, democratic reforms are coming through, however, it's observing. It's really observing, seeing what changes. And, you know, the underlying fear from so many states was that, okay, well, if we're worried about Islamization. And I think that fear is being underlined now with Egypt. And it's being underlined with Libya as well.
Sorry, yes. Yes.
Question, Turkey wasn't mentioned at all. And Turkey is, I see it as a sort of a possible bridge between Europe and the Arab world. And I remember when the Turkish Prime Minister's party gained power in about 2004, some people were scared, and I said, well, these moderate Muslim parties are like Christian Democrats in politics. So please comment.
Well, I wanted to add in Turkey as well, but pressed for time. Like I said, Turkey's seen as the pivotal example of a functioning Islamic democracy in the Middle East, and that's what so many groups have aspired to. And to add in as I said, to throw in Turkey was a lot more to add in. However, they are seen as the pillar of Islamic democracy, so they play a very important role now in the Middle East.
Can I just jump in?
Sorry, by all means, Natalie.
As part of the research project that I do, I've been a bit involved in the question of Turkey as well. There is a fundamental problem that Turkey has been a candidate for EU membership for a very long time. And when the Iron Curtain fell, precedence was given to the ex-communist countries as against Turkey for all sorts of reasons, right? In part to do with economic interest, to do with strategic interests, but primarily also, I think, because also of the member states concerned about their opinions, about their public opinion. Public opinion in Europe is against Turkey joining, right? And what has been happening in Turkey itself, and which is clear, specialists of Turkey will say that Turkey has given up, right? They still go through the motions of saying there's two candidates, but they've changed. Instead of looking towards the west, they're now looking east and south. And I agree with your comment about obviously Turkey being a bridge, right? Certainly coming up, right? That a lot of the more democratically minded forces in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and so on, right, are looking towards Turkey, right, as a model, right, of a successful model of a secular democracy, because Turkey is a secular democracy, but of a country with a majority of Muslims, right? And the country which is in power, yes, is a Muslim country, just as the Christian Democratic parties led, that had those big figures that actually created the first European institution. I don't know, was a strong Catholic, right? The Christian Democrats played a huge role, right, in the construction of a well-functioning European democracy, right? So it, I suppose, intersects with the questions that I've been talking about, right? This hostility and fundamental suspicion. And that suspicion, yes, is motivating in part because, yes, there is the threat of violent jihad. There is also the fear, for example, in Egypt. Egypt is the weak one, right? Tunisia has very good chances if they can get economic support, right? Because if you don't get economic support, that's when the fundamentalists get in, right? But Egypt is the one to watch, right? Because obviously, and that's why even in Algeria, you know, Europe went along with the Algerian parliament cancelling those elections way back, right, in the 90s, because they're afraid of the fundamentalists.
Okay,
But,
thanks. Still got a couple more questions?
yeah, sure.
I just love looking at a map of the world, okay? And basically the domino effect. Now, basically, it's all about this humanitarian aid and all this kind of stuff. But maybe I'm a little bit cynical. But the thing is that it appears like a strategy to me. Okay, what I see is, you know, you guys saying and America saying and EU saying is that yes, it's all about democracy and stuff like that. I don't see it like that. Okay, I see it. What is the economic interests? I haven't heard anything about what is the economic interests that are in these countries. No one has mentioned about that, say, with Libya, okay, especially Libya, okay. Everyone perceives that this country was in turmoil. It wasn't, okay. Basically Syria. Now, if we look at the rebels and the forces and the stuff like that, who is funding those? Who are these rebels? Are they? I mean, I know who they are, but no one has the guts to say anything on the radios, on the TV, in this forum, even here. What is the economic interest of? And I believe that what the EU has done, this is my opinion, is doing. France, Britain, okay, Germany to some lesser extent, is actually creating. You said something about the Salafi here being peaceful and warrior-like. I believe that what's happening over in the Middle East at the moment, from what the EU actions are, NATO actions are, US actions are, is not actually creating more peaceful solutions through democracy. It's more of a resource grab and is actually creating more hostility.
So you're saying Europe's still kind of got this colonial sort of mentality?
No,
I
I think I can see it as a resource grab, okay? And also, if you look at the strategic locations, okay, from where Egypt is, right through to where Iran is, the Bass Strait, or well, not the Bass Strait, it's Australia, but basically this whole point here,
Yep.
okay, can't you see the domino?
I think at this stage we'll take that as a comment, okay?
But
Just see if there's any other.
But no one's mentioned anything about the economic
I
interest.
think you're raising that question about economic interest is helpful. I'm just conscious that there are 2 or 3 more people who've got their hands up.
Can I just add in something as well?
Sure.
Sorry. I do see the strategic side as well. I mean, I didn't want to touch on too much because migration is going to be discussed today, but migration is a huge factor as well. I mean, you look at Lampedusa in Italy, you had Tunisian migrants arriving in Lampedusa, you have people dying trying to get to Italy. I think strategic's a big issue in regards to migration. I mean, 90% of migrants that arrive in the EU by land arrive via Greece. 69% of Tunisian youth are unemployed. I mean, I see it as a strategy option, but because of issues such as migration and also perhaps of what Natalie touched on before with the fear of radical Islam as well. But then I didn't want to touch on it too much because you're going to hear about it today. I didn't want to churn out all this information that you've heard 4 or 5 times.
Important issue to raise. Maybe.
I'm actually finishing a paper on the Egyptian revolution right now, and what hasn't been touched upon perhaps as well is the civil society aspect.
Yeah.
The opposition in lots of these countries was actually not unified, and it is not unified, it's very fragmented. And a little known aspect of the revolution is that some revolutionary actors were actually trained in some European countries. They received assistance from civil society organizations in the EU, and I'm in touch with quite a few leaders of those, 2 years before the revolution. So they've learned techniques of non-violent resistance. However, like it was just mentioned, there are lots of other groups which actually promote violence, and I would love to see Sharia law imposed and so on. So you have many, many different actors calling for revolution. Unfortunately, the non-violent actors, which were trained in a couple of European countries, are in a vast minority. and the ones calling for violence are at the moment in majority in places like Egypt. And a lot of assistance is still being provided by European civil society NGOs directly in Egypt, in Tunisia and other countries. They actually fly in and try and train the new civil society actors. However, this is basically a contested space for funding and for influence. And just to Natalie's point, one thing which I saw in recent basically terrorist attacks in Croatia, if you saw in the last week, there is a right-wing radicalism kind of copying Baden-Meinhof-Gruppe, Red Brigades and so on. But this guy, who is one of the instigators of violence, gave a speech, and in the background was an Arabic language. Basically, he's a Croatian right-wing activist calling for violence against EU institutions in Croatia and against government institutions which kind of would like Croatia and join the EU. But in the background was an Arabic language kind of sermon of some kind. So what is also happening in Europe, a lot of copycat groups are re-emerging, calling for violence, which are nothing to do with really Islam, or they're not Muslim in any way. But they're using this as a kind of gathering source of inspiration.
Like a platform.
Like a platform, and that has never happened well, it hasn't happened for a while, especially, I mean, you had traditionally right-wing terrorism in Europe. But now what we're seeing is the emergence of this merger. And I would just like to get Natalie's comments on what could this mean actually for the future.
I think this is a very good point, in particular the influence of the Serbian movement, which I forgot.
Yes, for the civil society.
The acronym is.
For civil society, Otpor, basically they're the ones training.
Which has been very active in actually reaching out to people in countries like Tunisia, Egypt and so on, with a philosophy which is of non-violent revolutionary change, which goes right against obviously what the jihadists have been pushing for a long time. So I think that's a very good point. It's there, but we don't see it. It's not reported.
I'm finishing a paper on that.
Okay, thanks very much. No, I'm afraid we need to finish that conversation here. We've exhausted our time. So thank you very much indeed.